You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to episode 352 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. People of African descent have made great contributions to the United States and its history. Think about all of the food, music, dance, medicine, farming practices, and religious practices the people of African descent brought with them to North America. Over time, we know that they adapted these features of their African cultures so that today, these same cultural features comprise significant and integral aspects of our larger American culture. People of African descent also helped the United States come into being. Yes, many enslaved Africans worked to transform the landscape of colonial North America by practicing skilled trades, building infrastructure, and growing different kinds of farm produce. But enslaved and free Africans and African Americans also helped fight for the United States in its war for independence. And they have continued to fight after that war to help the United States achieve its revolutionary ideals of freedom and equality. Matthew Skick, a curator of exhibitions at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, joins us to investigate the life and deeds of the Forten family, a family of African-descended people who worked in the Revolutionary era and beyond to help build a better world for their family, community, state, and nation. Now, during our investigation of the Fortens, Matthew reveals information about the Museum of the American Revolution's new Black Founders exhibit and why this exhibit features the Forten family of Philadelphia. Details about the life and deeds of James Forten, a veteran of the Revolutionary War and a savvy businessman who worked tirelessly to make the revolutionary ideals of freedom and equality a reality in his community, state, and nation. And the lives and deeds of James Forten's children and grandchildren, all of whom shared Forten's desire for the United States to live up to its founding principles. But first, did you know that Ben Franklin's World has a newsletter? The Ben Franklin's World Gazette, that's the name of our newsletter, publishes every time a new episode posts. The newsletter includes the show notes for that new episode, as well as links to the episode transcript and to all the books and media we talk about in that episode. To receive this newsletter, visit benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. That's benfranklinsworld.com/newsletter. And with that, allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is an expert in the material culture and social history of the colonial and revolutionary eras. He's the author of numerous articles and exhibit catalogs, including Liberty, Don Troiani's Paintings of the Revolutionary War. And he currently works as a curator of exhibitions at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Matthew Skick.
Thank you very much, Liz. It's a pleasure to be here.
Matthew, I understand that this is a really exciting time for you and the Museum of the American Revolution, and that you're all set to unveil a brand new exhibition called Black Founders, the Forten family of Philadelphia. So, would you give us an overview and the lay of the land of Black Founders and what prompted the museum to create this brand new exhibit?
Definitely. Black Founders is an exhibit that is telling the story of a family of free African Americans in Philadelphia from 1776 to 1876. So covering about 100 years and 3 generations of one family, beginning with the story of James Forten, who was born free in Philadelphia in 1766 and then grew up the midst of revolution here in Philadelphia. And James Forten served aboard a privateer ship during the Revolutionary War. He was captured by the British and held aboard a British prison ship. He survived that experience, became an apprenticed sailmaker in Philadelphia, and then took over a sailmaking business and became one of the wealthiest African American men in the United States in the early 19th century. He got married, had a family of his own, and then really used his wealth, his writing talents, his education, his influence to advance the promises of equality stated in the Declaration of Independence. And this is something his children and his grandchildren also continued on. So that's why we're deciding to cover 3 generations of the Forten family as a family of revolutionaries carrying on these revolutionary ideals.
You gave us a bit of a sneak preview, and I wonder if we could dig further into who the Fortens were and where they came from. It sounds like James Forten may have been the first Forten of Philadelphia, but do we know anything about his family's origins and how they came to Philadelphia in the United States?
James Forten, when he was born in 1766, both of his parents were free. His father was working as a sailmaker in Philadelphia. His mother may have been enslaved when she was born, but at some point during her life before she had James, she had gained her freedom. And according to James Forten, one of his grandfathers was enslaved, perhaps in the early 18th century. So when James is born in 1766, his family has some long Philadelphia roots already, but James Forten is the one that brings the Forten name into the consciousness of the larger Philadelphia community.
Yeah, it does sound like the Fortens had deep roots in Philadelphia by the time of James's birth, and that those roots were something that James Forten would grow and expand during his lifetime. Now, speaking of James, I'd like to focus on him for a bit, as he was the well-known patriarch of the Forten family of Philadelphia. Now, you mentioned that he was born in 1766, which would have meant that James Forten would have come of age in revolutionary America, and that he would have been exposed to both loyalist and revolutionary rhetoric, as well as the rhetoric of slavery and anti-slavery viewpoints at this very early stage in his life. So, Matthew, would you tell us a bit more about Forten's life as a free Black individual living in a colonial situation in which there were both enslaved people and pro-slavery views?
James Forten is growing up at a time when Philadelphia and what would become the United States is going to go through change. James Forten, as a free Black young person in Philadelphia, he is exposed to these revolutionary ideas pretty early on. When he's walking the streets of Philadelphia, he's walking past places like Carpenter's Hall and the Pennsylvania State House, where the First and Second Continental Congresses meet. And on July 8th, 1776, he is present for the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence. He is in the crowd, and it's a crowd that is a pretty diverse crowd because Philadelphia is a pretty diverse place at the time. It has a population of approximately 30,000 people, and this is a city that's filled with a lot of German speakers, Europeans from Western and Central Europe. You're hearing Gaelic and Irish, you're hearing French, but you're also encountering free and enslaved African Americans and people of African descent. And so James Forten, as he's just 9 years old in this crowd, he is hearing these words for the first time, like the Philadelphians surrounding him. And they seem to be pretty inspirational to James Forten because this is a moment of hearing the Declaration of Independence read for the first time that James Forten continued to reference throughout his life. And at the time, his father had just passed away a couple of years before. He had to leave his schooling in order to help support his family. So he has to mature quickly because of his family situation. And then also he's growing up in the middle of a war. And no one knows what the outcome of this war is going to be. Nobody knows how this revolutionary moment is going to continue. But James Forten is there for it. And he's literate, so he's reading the words. He's probably encountering newspapers that's describing what's going on in other parts of the United States. So his experience growing up in Philadelphia, where it's not only a political capital, but a hub of military industry, James Forten is surrounded by the American Revolution and the War for Independence.
On July 8, 1776, when James Forten would have heard the Declaration of Independence read aloud for the first time ever, he would have been 10 years old, which seems a bit young for someone to be declaring their politics. But, we also have to account for this is a time when people had to make decisions like, do we fight for independence or do we try to remain loyal? Do we try to remain neutral or disaffected? So Forten was growing up in a place where these questions are being asked constantly. What do we know about Forten's decision-making? Was he capable at 10 years old of making some of these political assessments and trying to answer these questions for himself?
So we don't have any of James Forten's writings from that period when he was a young man in Philadelphia, but we do know about some of the actions that he took. One of the most notable actions is his military service, choosing to serve for the cause of the new United States. There's also some evidence that suggests he might have been working with a sailmaker in the city named Robert Bridges, whom his father had worked for. Robert Bridges may have employed Forten doing things like stitching for sailmaking, but also making supplies for Pennsylvania troops, that both the militias that are formed, but also for continental regiments. Robert Bridges is involved in the military industry, and James Forten might have had a hand in some of that. But James Forten's most notable action during the war is signing up to serve aboard a privateer ship in the summer of 1781. 1781 is a moment in time. This is before the siege of Yorktown. Of course, at this point, nobody knows when the Revolutionary War is going to end or if it will ever end. So the outcome is much in doubt and uncertain. But James Forten, his decision to serve aboard the ship, we have to understand what it meant to be a privateer in order to get a sense of why might James Forten have made this decision. Being a privateer in this moment is an opportunity to not only serve the cause of the United States, but also to gain some money. But this is at great risk. So being a privateer, this is a privately owned vessel that is being licensed by the Continental Congress, in this case, to sail on behalf of the United States and attack enemy vessels. And if the privateer ship was successful in capturing an enemy vessel, they would call that a prize. They would bring the prize back to the port of Philadelphia, where it would be assessed by a civilian court to say that the prize was taken legally, and then the contents and the ship would be auctioned off, and then the crew that captured that ship, depending on their status as a member of that crew, would receive a portion of that prize money. And so James Forten had an opportunity to gain some money that maybe he and his family needed, while also serving the cause of the United States. The ideas of freedom and equality that James Forten heard back in 1776 may have been inspirational to him in saying, this is what I feel like we need to fight for. An opportunity for common people to have a say in their government, to participate in these democratic and republican principles that are being promoted. So serving aboard the Royal Lewis had this dual purpose for James Forten, but it came with a risk, with many risks, in fact, and especially for a free man of African descent. Because let's say James Forten and the crew of the Royal Lewis was captured by the British. Would James' freedom become in jeopardy? Would he be thrown into slavery in the Caribbean? Would he be enslaved elsewhere? So James Forten's decision and his action speaks louder than words because he's taking this risk to serve aboard this ship.
Okay, so we don't have any of James Forten's writings from when he's a child and growing up amidst the revolution and making these rather adult decisions about which side to support during the revolution. But what is striking to me, what I find so curious, is that Forten chose to support the revolutionaries when so many other people of African descent chose to support the British. And in fairness, many of them were trying to support the British in exchange for their freedom, which is something that James Forten was born with. But is this question and decision, especially for African Americans, choosing which loyalties to side with during the revolution, is this a question or a decision something that you grapple with in this new exhibit, Black Founders?
So this is something we bring up because this is a decision that thousands of people of African descent living in the United States face as the war comes to different regions of the United States. So when the British enter Philadelphia in the fall of 1777, there's still lingering ideas about the proclamation from 1775 that the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, had issued offering freedom to enslaved men that were owned by, as he put them, rebel owners. Dunmore was offering freedom to those who served to combat this rising revolutionary effort in Virginia. And so that idea of freedom in exchange for service with the British is still present in 1777 when the British march into Philadelphia. And there's no records that James Forten and his family went elsewhere or left Philadelphia when about a third of the population fled when the British entered. It seems like James Forten and his family stayed in the city. And there are hundreds of men and women that are from the Philadelphia region, people of African descent, who actually decide to go with the British and kind of plant their flag with them in hopes of freedom, or if they are already free, the hopes of a better life. But James Forten doesn't make that choice. And when he is serving aboard the Royal Lewis is indeed captured by a British vessel. And according to Forten, he kind of befriends the British captain's son of the ship that captured the Royal Lewis. And the British captain even offers James the chance to live in England with his son. But James Forten turns that aside, claiming that he didn't want to turn his back on the United States that he had committed himself to. So he decides to endure the difficulties aboard the British prison ship Jersey for 7 months. So James Forten seemed to have this conviction of serving the United States and fighting for these ideals. But you're right that thousands of people of African descent decided that the British were offering the best chances at freedom. And James Forten likely knew that and knew about these stories of people of African descent joining up with the British and following the British army, but he decided to stay firm in his beliefs for the United States.
Do we know anything about what may have influenced Forten to stay true to these beliefs, to side with the rebellion colonies in the new United States? Because, again, he's just so young, and yet he seems to have these really deep-seated convictions about staying true to this cause. And I just have to wonder that perhaps later in life, when he's thinking about his youth, he might have written down what gave him this drive to support the revolutionary cause.
Yeah, so he brings up some key moments in his writings later in life. I've already mentioned how he continually refers to hearing the Declaration of Independence read for the first time on July 8, 1776. He's sort of saying in his writings that he's there at this foundational moment for the country. And another moment that he brings up is seeing soldiers of African and Native American descent in the ranks of the Continental Army. And a particular moment that he notes is one that he witnessed actually on his 15th birthday. So September 2nd, 1781. And this is when he had just returned to Philadelphia from his first voyage aboard the Royal Lewis. It was quite a successful voyage, and Forten and the crew are able to capture a couple British ships, tow them back into Philadelphia, and then they get ready to set sail again. But on September 2nd, 1781, General Washington's army is on its way marching south for a secret operation to march down to Virginia from their camps in New York and New England and besiege the British army that's at Yorktown, Virginia. So Philadelphia is one of the main stops along this route. And so on September 2nd, 1781, General Washington's army parades down Chestnut Street, which is where Pennsylvania State House, what we call Independence Hall, is. They march right past the facade of the Pennsylvania State House and then encamp on the western edge of the city near the Schuylkill River. And James Forten was there for this. He's there to witness the army marching through. And in some of his later writings, including in a letter that he wrote in 1831 to his friend and fellow abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, he writes about seeing what he calls the New England Regiment. He's probably referring to the Rhode Island Regiment. It's a regiment that in 1781 had 2 full companies of private soldiers of Native American and African American descent led by white officers. And so he remembers seeing that there were men of color in this regiment, including full companies of them. And he describes this moment as being inspirational. And he considered these men, in his words, as brave men as ever fought. So seeing the bravery that these soldiers are showing as they're marching off down to the south, seeing that these men had enlisted in Continental Army, seeing that these men were fighting for liberty and equality, seemed to be inspirational to him. And this is a story that he seemed to have told not just to Garrison, but to many people he knew. So that's another sort of moment in time that seems to be inspirational to James Forten.
It's just really amazing and awe-inspiring to see this young man with such a deep-seated conviction at a young age for the revolutionary cause. I mean, to the point where he has this opportunity to avoid time on the most infamous British prison ship that there is, the HMS Jersey, and yet he chooses to remain loyal to the United States. Now, speaking of the Jersey, I wonder if you could tell us anything about Forten's experience in this most infamous British prison ship.
Yeah, we do know a bit about it based on some of his memories and memories that fellow prisoners that survived shared about the experience. There's a lot of 19th century memoirs and histories that have been written about the Jersey and how hellish the experience was aboard the Jersey. The prisoners were dealing with things like cramped conditions in this old British warship and dealing with dysentery and smallpox and poor food and that sort of thing. So when James Forten was aboard that ship for 7 months, there were opportunities for exchanges and being paroled and that sort of thing. But there was even opportunities to escape. And one opportunity that came up was an American officer that was being held aboard the Jersey was being exchanged. And this officer had some sort of trunk with him. And James Forten was apparently small enough that he could fit inside this trunk and sort of sneak off the boat being carried in this trunk. But Daniel Bruton, who was also aboard the Jersey, a young white man, seemed to be doing worse than Forten was health-wise during this prison term. And Forten gave up his spot in that trunk to Bruton, and Bruton went inside the trunk and successfully made it off the ship.
Forten was captured so close to the end of the war that all told he only spent 7 or 8 months aboard the HMS Jersey. And I don't want to downplay it. This ship was the most notorious prison ship and the conditions were just horrible. But Forten does survive and he is paroled. Matthew, what did Forten do after his parole and after his service to the revolutionary's cause?
So Forten in 1782 is paroled. He is let off the ship, and then it's not like they're going to pay for his passage back to Philadelphia or send him home. They just kind of leave him there, and he's supposed to make his way back as best he could. And according to Forten and Forten's eulogists, James Forten walked all the way back to Philadelphia, making a stop in Trenton, New Jersey for some respite, and then eventually making his way back to Philadelphia to his family. So in the 1780s, he's in Philadelphia. He's trying to reestablish himself. This is when he's in his late teenage years. And he, along with his brother-in-law, go on a bit of an adventure, thinking about a way to earn money and see the world a bit. So they actually go to London and spend some time there. But James Forten returns to Philadelphia. His experience in London may have been pretty influential. This is where he's seeing a pretty diverse city, one of the largest cities in the world at the time. And he's seeing fellow free people of African descent in the streets of London. He is seeing a major port city, dockyards, and people from all over Europe. So it's unclear why he decides to come back, but he does decide to come back and returns to Philadelphia. And soon thereafter, he apprentices himself to his father's former employer, Robert Bridges, that sailmaker who I mentioned. And so James quickly becomes a trusted worker for Bridges, and Bridges appoints James Forten to be his foreman of the shop. And Bridges had employed an integrated workforce, but it was an unusual choice at the time for a white sailmaker, Robert Bridges, to appoint an African-American man, James Forten, as his foreman. He is now in charge of that integrated workforce and making sure workflow is happening, making sure that inventory is kept. and making sure that work is progressing on these contracts that Bridges got to make sales. So this is a man who is working his way up the ladder very quickly. And in the 1790s, as Forten is continuing to be employed by Bridges, Bridges sort of invests in Forten. He buys James Forten his first house, for example, on Shippen Street, which is now Bainbridge Street. As Bridges is beginning to think about retirement, he amassed quite a bit of wealth for himself. He was one of the most successful sailmakers in the city of Philadelphia. And Bridges often described himself in records as a merchant, so entering this upper class of wealth. And so instead of passing on this business to one of his sons, Bridges is thinking that he wants his sons to do better than working with their hands and working in trade. He wants them to be lawyers or doctors or merchants themselves. And so Bridges seems to have trusted Forten in such a way that he actually decides to basically give his business to James Forten. And that happens in 1798. So James Forten becomes the owner of this sailmaking business and owns that business from 1798 until his death in 1842. And he continues it to be one of the most successful sailmakers in Philadelphia. And that's what is the core of James Forten's wealth and prosperity as a free African-American person in the early 19th century.
I'd like for us to dig deeper into James Forten's business as the owner and operator of what becomes a very successful sail loft. But first, I think we should take some time to discuss Forten's time in London and take a moment for our episode sponsor. As we discuss how Africans and African Americans built the wealth of the early United States, it seems fitting to highlight a wonderful exhibition at the art museums of colonial Williamsburg. It's called I Made This, the work of Black American artists and artisans. I Made This celebrates the lives of Black American artists and artisans through the material culture that they made between the 18th and 20th centuries. Objects and works included in the I Made This exhibition include nearly 30 examples of paintings, furniture, textiles, decorative sculptures, quilts, tools, and metal goods. And this exhibition doesn't just feature the great work created by Black Americans, it also includes their personal stories. To learn more about this wonderful exhibition and how you can see it, visit benfranklinsworld.com/IMadeThis. That's benfranklinsworld.com/IMadeThis. Matthew, you mentioned that James Forten went to London, and there he's experiencing life in this very large, very diverse city where he can see that Blacks and whites are living together and coexisting in probably a different way than they are in the new United States. Do we know anything about whether Forten believed that this experience he's having in London would have been possible to recreate in post-revolutionary Philadelphia?
Yeah, I wonder if he is thinking about whether his city, Philadelphia, his native city, could be more like London, where there's, not total racial harmony, of course, but people are okay with Black people and white people living side by side and working side by side in maritime trades and in making London a humming port. Philadelphia at the time was one of the largest ports in North America, if not the largest, and New York and Baltimore eventually would surpass it. But Philadelphia, as this cosmopolitan city, is sort of like a miniature London in North America. And I wonder if James Forten had ideas about this newly independent nation, the United States of America. I wonder if he's inspired by what he sees in London and hopes to bring that back with him to Philadelphia to improve his native city and improve it in terms of advancing these ideas of freedom and equality in Philadelphia.
To turn now to James Forten's business acumen and his work, you told us how Forten was a really hard worker and that he was so adept at running Robert Bridges' sail loft that Bridges left that sail shop to Forten when he retired. Could you tell us anything about how James Forten turned Bridges' successful sail loft into an even more successful sail loft?
So James Forten is continuing to employ an integrated workforce, and there was probably some questions about whether the white employees of Robert Bridges would continue to work under James Forten. But it seems like nobody left the shop in sort of protest of a Black man now owning this business. They seem to have really supported Forten, and he seemed to be a fair boss and a fair employer. So Forten's efforts to expand his business and continue its success. He seems to have some good business acumen about making right decisions, about advertising and building a clientele. He is also seeming to be toying with inventions in order to make sales a bit more efficient. We think about fuel efficiency today. The wind is the fuel of these ships. So effective sales, durable sales are key to the operations of a ship, which is then key to the operations of an economically successful port.
James Forten had quite the business sense. He turned that sail off from an impressive business into an impressive business empire. He turned a really successful shop into an even more successful sail loft, and he amassed a wealth that any American would have found unimaginable. And when it came time for James Forten to spend his wealth, he chooses to give a lot of that wealth back to the community at Philadelphia, and particularly to the Black communities of Philadelphia. So Matthew, could you tell us more about Forten as a change maker in both Philadelphia and the United States, and tell us about the ways that he used his wealth to create change in moving towards the ideals that he heard read out loud in the Declaration of Independence?
James Forten doesn't take his wealth or his education or his talents for granted. Instead, he uses them for good. He is known for that during his lifetime. Apart from his business, he is also investing money in Philadelphia and investing money in the Black community. He is making available loans to the Black community of Philadelphia so people could maybe move from being the renter of a home to a homeowner. Not only is doing that with a philanthropic mind, but he's also doing it with a money-making mind. He's thinking about this might benefit the community, but it's also going to benefit my wallet. He's extremely well respected. People call him the Venerable James Forten. And he's widely known for being a philanthropist. He is donating money to causes to support orphaned children. He's donating money to support widows. He's also contributing money to patriotic efforts. James Forten is even investing in the Peel Museum in Philadelphia. But he and his family, especially his wife Charlotte, their daughter Margareta, they're really interested in creating and furthering educational opportunities for the African American communities in Philadelphia. And so they are sponsoring schools along with other wealthy free African Americans, such as the Cassie family and the Douglas family. They are sponsoring teachers and tutors for African American children. Margareta Forten, James's daughter, becomes a noted educator in some of the African American schools that are established. So education is very much a hot button issue for them. And the racial prejudice that Philadelphia's Black community faced in regards to education was something that the Fortens found to be very disappointing, and they wanted to change that and become change makers in that way and providing opportunities where doors were closed to the African American community.
The Museum of the American Revolution's exhibit, Black Founders, contains a lot of great information about the very fascinating life that James Forten lived. And it also contains information about the life and deeds of James Forten's prominent family members. Members like James's daughter, Margareta. Matthew, would you tell us about some of these other notable Forten family members and about their lives and deeds?
James Forten and his wife Charlotte have 9 children, 8 of whom survived to adulthood. The Forten children grow up in a household that is really committed to education and writing, and the children become very talented with music, with poetry, with speaking skills. Robert Bridges Forten, for example, one of James Forten's sons, was a noted orator, delivering speeches about abolition and equal rights. And so the children sort of carry on their mother and father's legacy of advocating for equal rights and the abolition of slavery. Charlotte Van Dyne Forten, along with her daughters, Margareta, Sarah, Harriet, Mary, they helped to establish one of the first integrated female anti-slavery societies. And that's the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, which was founded in 1833. Harriet Forten, this is one of James Forten's daughters, she and her husband, Robert Purvis, they become sort of a rising generation of sort of power couple in Philadelphia in terms of abolition and the fight for equality. While Harriet is working on establishing the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, just before that, Robert Purvis had helped to organize the American Anti-Slavery Society. Another of James Forten's daughters, Sarah L. Forten, was a noted poet, and she was a frequent contributor to the Liberator newspaper, the abolitionist paper established by William Lloyd Garrison. Her most famous poem is called The Grave of the Slave, published first in 1834. And Sarah L. Forten's poem is talking about how, in many cases, enslaved people can only find freedom in the grave. So Sarah's poem, The Grave of the Slave, sort of becomes an abolitionist rallying cry. The next generation of Forten's, James Forten's grandchildren, they are also continuing this effort into the Civil War era, into the Reconstruction era. Charlotte L. Forten, that many people might know by her married name, Charlotte Forten Grimke. During the Civil War, she was helping to educate recently freed people of African descent in South Carolina. There's also Charles Burley Purvis, who is the son of James Forten's daughter, Harriet, and her husband, Robert Purvis. Charles Burley Purvis was a physician and a leader of Howard University's medical school when it was first established. So this Forten family story that we're telling is focusing on these three generations. They're very much a family of community organizers.
Wow. There are certainly a lot of Fortens who are featured in this exhibit who did what sounds like a lot of really great and important work. Now, when we come to see the Black Founders exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, what do you hope that we'll better understand after our visit? What is the big takeaway that you want us to have after visiting Black Founders?
One of the larger concepts that I think this exhibit really brings out is thinking about being an active member of your community. The Fortens really were a community-minded family. They were constantly thinking about not only what it was best for them, but what was best for their community and making their neighborhood, their city, and their state and nation better places to live for all. The Fortens were continually donating their time and talents, and they were advancing the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, the ideas of freedom and equality, the ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so that's one of the reasons why we wanted to call this exhibit Black Founders. James Forten is living and contributing to the founding of the United States, but the later generations of his family, his children and his grandchildren, even though they didn't live through the 8 years of the Revolutionary War, they are still carrying on and advancing the revolutionary ideals of the Declaration of Independence. I'm hoping that it can be inspirational to many Americans today to think about being active community members, thinking about how I can be a better neighbor and community member, and having sort of a philanthropic mindset, just like the Fortens.
Now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Matthew, several times throughout our conversation, you told us about the importance of James Forten hearing the Declaration of Independence read out loud on January 8, 1776. So in your opinion, what might have happened if Forten had never heard the Declaration of Independence read out loud on January 8, 1776? Do you think Forten still would have supported the American Revolution?
That's a great question. If he wasn't there for the public reading on July 8, 1776, I still think that growing up in Philadelphia when he did, during the years of the war, with Philadelphia being this sort of beehive of activity where politicians and soldiers and men, women, and children are contributing to the war effort and being affected by the war in many different ways, ideas about freedom and equality are being shared widely and debated. This is also the city where the first Gradual Abolition Act is passed in the United States. The Gradual Abolition Act of 1780, something that James Forten probably heard quite a bit about. This is where the first formal anti-slavery society meets in 1775 and then reconvenes in the 1780s. There's a lot of revolutionary ideas going on. So I think James Forten would still be influenced by those activities.
Matthew, I think you piqued a lot of our curiosities about the Black Founders exhibit. So what do we need to know about coming to see this exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution?
One of the things I want to emphasize is that with this exhibit, we're sort of helping to recreate, in part, the material world of the Fortens, and also bringing together their writings, some of the objects that they owned, and presenting them to the public in a way that hasn't been done before. We've connected well with descendants of James Forten, and we'll be displaying original artifacts from the family that have never been displayed before. They've never been studied by historians because they've always remained in the family. This includes a table from James Forten's household on Lombard Street. We're displaying needlework samplers stitched by two of James Forten's daughters, Margaretta and Mary Forten. Again, never before exhibited, never before published. We're displaying some of the personal belongings of Robert Purvis, James Forten's son-in-law, directly from his descendants. But then this exhibit is trying to be an exhibit that is accessible to a variety of learning styles and audiences. There's different hands-on components to this exhibit. For example, we have recreated a portion of the Forten Sail Loft where you'll get to work with a museum educator to get a feel for the sailmaking trade, sit at a sailmaker's bench, handle some reproduction tools used by sailmakers. You'll get to try on clothing that a revolutionary sailor like James Forten would have worn at sea. Later on in the exhibit, you'll encounter soundscapes and a listening station interactive to think about the music that the Forten family would have been very familiar with. And this is specifically the music of African-American composer and band leader Francis Johnson, who was a neighbor of the Fortens and a friend of the family. You'll even hear recreations of readings of some of James Forten's and Sarah L. Forten's writings as soundscapes in the exhibit. So there's a lot in this exhibit that will be appealing to a variety of audiences.
Now, for those of us who can't make the trip to Philadelphia, does the Museum of the American Revolution have any online or digital components of Black Founders that we can visit with and interact with online?
Yes, we do. Launching in spring of 2023 is going to be a virtual tour of Black Founders. And this virtual tour features 360-degree photography of the entire exhibit. So using your computer or tablet or smartphone, you'll be able to navigate your way through the exhibit using this 360-degree photography and click on the labeling, click on the objects to learn more. It's replicating the experience of actually visiting the exhibit. It will be complemented with downloadable teacher resource guides. So classroom educators can download resources to plan lessons and have activities related to the different themes of the exhibit. And so those will also be available on the museum's website, amrevmuseum.org.
And is amrevmuseum.org also the best place where we can find more information out about the museum and how we can visit its other exhibits and programs?
That's right. Yeah, you can find opening hours. The museum is open daily from 10 to 5, and we have some great evening programs and daily programs scheduled for this exhibit. And you can find out more about those and learn more about the exhibit on the website.
Matthew Skick, thank you for joining us and for taking us on an overview tour of the Black Founders exhibit at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and for introducing us to James Forten and his incredible family.
My pleasure, Liz. It was a real treat to be on, and I look forward to seeing many of you at the exhibit.
How can you be an active member of your community and work to improve that community? It seems all of the members of the Forten family we discussed asked themselves these very questions and acted upon the answers they came up with. So many Fortens worked to improve the lives of their families, their fellow Philadelphians, and their fellow Americans. In the case of James Forten, that work took the shape of supporting the United States and fighting for its independence. As Matthew related, James Forten was just a young boy and a young man when the Revolution broke out and Philadelphia became a revolutionary capital. But despite his young age, Forten chose the revolutionary cause. He worked with the sailmaker Robert Bridges to make sails and supplies for American soldiers and sailors. He also signed up to serve as a privateer as soon as he became old enough to crew a ship. Like many Americans, James Forten looked for ways to support his new nation while also supporting his family. Privateer life offered Forten that opportunity. Like others of African descent who enlisted in the Continental Army and Navy, Forten took a great risk by placing his freedom and liberty on the line by serving as a privateer. While all Americans put their lives on the line, white Americans didn't exactly have to worry about being captured and sold into slavery if they were caught. But soldiers and sailors of African descent did have this added worry. Now, after the war, Forten looked for ways to establish himself and make a difference. After experiencing the great diversity of London and its greater acceptance of the idea that Black and white Britons could live and work side by side, Forten returned to Philadelphia, possibly with the idea that he could affect a similar way of life in his home country. So Forten returned to Robert Bridges' sail shop and worked his way up from apprentice to foreman. He managed an integrated workforce and eventually purchased the sail loft. As a business owner, Forten used his business acumen to turn Bridges' sail loft from a successful business into an even more successful business. A business that brought in large amounts of income that enabled Forten to start and educate his family and invest in his community. James Forten never stopped believing that the United States could be a nation that offered freedom and equality for all. And he passed on this belief to his children and grandchildren, many of whom went on to support education at all levels for Black children, financial investments that supported Black communities, and the causes of anti-slavery and abolition. The Forten family stands as an example of how ordinary Americans can make a real difference, and how ordinary Americans can work to make their communities, states, and nation support their founding principles. You'll find more information about Black founders, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/352. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Joseph Edelman, Holly White, and Ian Tonat. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other people and families remind you of the Fortens? Is there one that you'd like to know more about? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.